Yogena chittasya padena vacham malam sharirasya cha vaidekena yopankarottam pravaram muninam Patanjalim pranjaliranatosmi stuve Patanjalim Vyasam Shankaram cha munitrayam kartra sutrasya bhashyasya kramat vivaranasya cha. Now, in the last class, we were dealing with this important topic, that is the second important topic in the first part of it. That is in the Sadhanapada. The Sadhanapada constitutes the second chapter of Patanjali Yoga Sutras in printed form. So, the first part is Kriya Yoga. The second topic discussed in the Sadhanapada is Dukkha Chaturvyuha. We already discussed some portions of it. The sutra is this very important from the spiritual point of view. Parinama Tapa Samskara Duhkha Gunavritti Virodhacha Dukkhameva Sarvam Vivekinaha. It's a famous sutra. The meaning is this: for a person, for a wise person who has a sense of discrimination in the sense of wisdom, maturity of mind, maturity of approach, spiritually and culturally grown up person. For such a person, everything is sorrowful. We should not get away with the impression that this sutra is a bit pessimistic in its nature. Not at all. It is a very profound, philosophically very insightful part of the whole text. So to a person, to a wise person, for a yogi, Vivekinaha, Viveka, literally Viveka means the ability to understand what is real, what is worthwhile, what is the right thing and what is its opposite. A person who has got a discerning mind that helps him to recognize what is worthwhile, what is desirable, what is appropriate, what is proper from its opposite. That is Viveka, a discerning mind. So for any person of a discerning mind, discerning maturity, everything in this world is sorrowful. The reasons are this: because of the suffering resulting from the changefulness of experience, anguish, vasanas, and also because of the mutual conflict of the gunas. This is the literal translation. So first we shall take the first topic, the first part of the sutra, Parinama Tapa. This is very important, very profound. What is Parinama Tapa? To give an example, in our life, very often, we confront some tragic, unpleasant experiences, shocking experiences. When we look back, we may feel, well, if I have done something differently, this would not have occurred. When we look back, of course, it is only wishful thinking. Many things happened, and when we look back, we try to find a cause for it, an explanation, a reason. And then we come to a feeling, well, I should not have done it that way. I should have done it differently, or I should not have done it at all. I should have acted more wisely, in a more understanding manner, with greater consideration. This comes to our mind. If such an identical, similar situation arises, I would do it differently, so that this tragic event won't happen to me. Now, suppose we had the wisdom, the same wisdom if we had earlier, perhaps these undesirable consequences would not have occurred. Suppose you have got the maturity, the wisdom to understand that many of these things that we are doing right now are not appropriate, though they may give momentary happiness, for some time happiness or pleasure. But gradually that pleasure will become pain. Still, many of us continue doing certain things in a certain way. But suppose we have the wisdom to change our mind and to act differently, so that the unfortunate consequence would not happen. Then that is related to Parinama Duhkha. Parinama Duhkha is possible only for a yogi, for a viveki, for a person of discerning mind. A yogi understands that though everything is going on very well now, there is plenty of money, plenty of wealth, plenty of everything, health, all that is desirable. So suppose life is very happy, everything going favorably. Still, if you have the discerning mind to understand that this happy state of affairs won't last long, and out of that you feel pain. Why you feel the pain? Because the enjoyment, the happiness, the favorable circumstances that we have right now won't last long. This discerning mind, this spiritual insight is the essence of Parinama Duhkha. Out of this you feel a pain. The painful, the tragic event has not happened. Before happening it, you are going through it mentally. And if we have this spiritual insight, then the real, actual unhappiness won't occur. The unhappy incident would not really happen if we enjoy unhappiness before that, even when we are in a state of happy, desirable, pleasant circumstances. That's why there is a famous description. Vyasa gives a very famous definition of what is Parinama Duhkha. Parinama Duhkada nama pratikula sukhavasthayam api yoginameva krishnati. It is possible only for yogis. Yogis here mean people with the discrimination, with a proper discerning mind, the ability to understand what is right and what is wrong. For such a person, even when everything is going on fine, sukhavasthayam, even when everything is going on fine, still that yogi realizes with his spiritual insight that this happy state of affairs won't last long. If we have that maturity of mind, then the real unhappiness would not happen. On the other hand, when everything is going on fine, you have health, wealth, money, status, everything, and you become completely immersed in that, forget the fact that these things will not last for long. Money will not last for long, health will not last for long. One day everything will be lost. Money or wealth or status, material pleasures need not be thrown out physically, but even while enjoying them, realize the fact that these things are not eternal, they are transitory in nature. This spiritual insight, if we can have, then we are saved. That's why Parinama Duhkada nama pratikula sukhavasthayam api yoginam eva krishnati. A real yogi, even when everything is going on fine, suffers. He really is not suffering. He realizes the fact that these things will not last for long. Out of this, he understands the possibility of its opposite, the opposite of happiness. Even when you are in a very happy situation, if you realize, well, one day these happy circumstances may change. Out of that you feel the transitoriness, a feeling, a suffering. It is not real suffering. Mentally you realize the fact that all these happy situations, pleasurable situations will change and will become painful. This realization is the essence of Parinama Duhkha. But this is possible only for a yogi, Vivekina. Those who do not have Viveka, those who do not have a discerning mind, they completely become merged when everything is going on fine. And then when the real unhappiness comes, they are crushed, they are lost. A yogi realizes before the tragedy occurs. So the tragedy never occurs to him. On the other hand, a person who doesn't have this viveka, this spiritual insight, he does not realize this fact. So when the unhappiness changes, when the happy circumstances change, and when the real unhappiness comes, when the real tragedy comes, an average person is completely lost. He is crushed. That's why there is a famous statement in the Mahabharata. It says, every day, every moment, we see people dying. If you calculate hours, minutes, days and months, you find practically somebody or something dies, vanishes, disappears from this world every moment. There is not a single moment when something, some creature or some human beings very often dies. But still we all feel within that we are eternal. We are really eternal in the spiritual sense. When we realize we are the Atman, the consciousness, we are eternal in the true sense of the term. But when normally we think that we are eternal, we think this body is eternal. This psychophysical mechanism is eternal. So all the efforts, all the pleasures, all the enjoyments and tragedies associated with this physical body are eternal. That's why ahanyahanni bhudani gechanti iha yamalayam sheshaha sthavaram icchanti kim ascharyam atah param. The greatest mystery, the greatest wonder and the greatest stupidity. That's what Yudhishthira calls this. In a way, it is the most foolish thing to imagine that we are, as physical body is going to be eternal. It is the most foolish thing. But we all believe that way. That's why Sheshaha sthavaram icchanti. So it is a great wonder. Well-educated people, intelligent people who are otherwise intelligent and knowledgeable think as physical bodies that are going to be eternal. Now you may not fully agree with me. Well, everyone knows that a cell gets destroyed every moment. So everyone knows. But then all our actions and thoughts, our struggles, competitions, jealousies, all that we normally understand to be the causes of miseries and tragedies are rooted in the fact that at the back of all these actions we think this body is eternal and this world is eternal, these physical enjoyments are eternal. That feeling intellectually we do not have. Every educated man understands that we are not going to live for long physically. But then our actions, when we lose our balance, our jealousies, competitions, all these are rooted in the lingering feeling within that we are all physically going to be eternal. So that is going to be a big wonder. That's what Yudhishthira says. So what is Parinama Duhkha? Parinama Duhkha is nothing. It is the ability to recognize the reality of grief and sorrow even when you are enjoying the desirable, the pleasurable, the enjoyable. This is possible only for the highest person of wisdom and viveka, or discrimination as it is called. So that's why this is a worldly man, he enjoys, worldly person, he enjoys and then suffers. When he enjoys, he thinks these enjoyments are going to be eternal. But really they are not going to be eternal. So when the objects of enjoyments vanish, sorrow comes in. But a yogi suffers now itself. Even when nothing is going wrong, when everything is going all right, the yogi realizes the reality of the transitoriness, what we call kshanikata in Sanskrit, of all these worldly pleasures. That is an important aspect of this Parinama Duhkha. There are other types of dukhas that we are going to discuss next. The second one is Tapa Duhkha. So we have to remember this sutra. Parinama, Tapa, Samskara Duhkaihi. So Parinama Duhkha is the Tapa Duhkha is the Samskara Duhkha is there. Parinama Duhkha is possible only for persons of spiritual insight, Vivekinaha or Yogis. Samskara Duhkha and Tapa Duhkha afflict all types of people. So that is an important point to remember. Next is Tapa Duhkha. Now, Tapa Duhkha is obstruction. It is caused by obstruction to enjoyment of pleasure. Because that causes dvesha, raga and dvesha. Raga is attachment. Dvesha is our negative feeling towards obstacles or obstructions to enjoyment or pleasures. Or the anxiety of losing what we have already got, what we are already enjoying. Or the intention to do harm to a person who may stand in the way of our enjoying the worldly pleasures. This is the real cause of Tapa Duhkha. And it is caused by Karmashaya. Karmashaya, we should remember, we already discussed this earlier. Karmashaya, but we have already discussed Karmashaya. Karmashaya is the real cause of birth, characteristics and actions. Whatever we do, we think, we act, we speak, all these are influenced by the totality of our character or behavior, or what you call samskara. And this is the result of accumulation of impressions gathered in previous life or in this life through various actions. So the great Vedantic scholar Sureshwaracharya, in a famous book Vartika Sara, he says, Vasana karma vidya chatrayam janma prayojagam uktam dehakhya vaishamyam karmana bhavet dehe vidya vasanabhyam bhavet bhogeshu kaushalam. So latent impressions of experiences. We may have experienced certain things in the past. If we have some impression, some memories, not necessarily memories, because memories technically, from the psychological point of view, memories are directly related to some actions, behaviors, experiences that we have undergone in this life. Because when we remember something, that memory is immediately accompanied by a name and a form. Name of that, the name need not be a language name, something that we try to explain in our mind, and its form, nama and rupa. But then latent impressions, which are more subtle, may not be identical with memories. See, to give an example, if we have some characteristics, thought patterns, even behavior patterns, impressions, which we cannot normally explain in the light of experiences that we have gone through in this life, then they come from previous life, because Karmashaya is the repository of all these impressions, which really causes this Tapa Duhkha, we are going to explain. Now, if our impressions are associated with a name and form, then they are related to some experience in this life. They come from this life. But if it is just a concept or an idea without any name and form, then they come from another source. Vedanta and Yoga will call it from previous life. So because name and form we don't remember when these impressions are coming from previous life. Because we associate a name with the help of mind and the sense of hearing. We hear something and that is retained in the mind, the chittam, the repository of memory. So if it is something that comes from this life, we have heard something when we are 5-year-old, we heard something. So that word is retained. That expression is retained, verbal expression is retained in the chitta. And we have seen, so the form is also retained, nama and rupa, name and form. Both are retained. So when the memory returns the mind, they come accompanied by name and form. But suppose some impressions occur again and again in the mind, without a corresponding name and form, and if that impression is very concrete and very strong, then that impression comes from previous life. Because when we change the body at the time of death, when we take another body at the time of rebirth or reincarnation, we lose the mechanism which retains the name and form, because we lose the mechanism through which we got these names and form. That's the idea behind. But again, in the next life also, this will not be completely lost. I can give an example. There are many examples you can find. Suppose you read a very profound philosophical, metaphysical work. If you are very young, you have not read it earlier, you just read it for the first time in your life. And a very complex philosophical, metaphysical, technical term, you are able to understand very quickly in all its different aspects. You just read once. You didn't perhaps learn from a teacher. Just read once. Immediately you are able to understand it fully, in a very comprehensive manner. Here, you don't remember the person from whom you have learned this in your previous life, because a new body has come. And you don't remember other details. But the Karmashaya residue is retained as chittam, and that is intact. That helps you to immediately understand in a very comprehensive manner the different implications and meaning of a particular philosophical term. This frequently happens. So the name and form vanish, but ideas and concepts remain intact when a person is reborn again and again. That's why Sureshwaracharya says, Vasana karma vidya cha trayam janma prayojaga muktam. How we are born, reborn rather. Strong impressions, and these impressions will guide us, will prompt us to certain actions. And how to do that? How to do that action, the act? Maybe reading something, doing technical job, medical work, which you did not learn very well in this life, but you are able to do it in a very good way, in a very efficient manner in this life for the first time. That means the vidya, that knowledge is retained, and that knowledge, impressions are retained, tendencies are retained. So all these prompt you towards action. That's what Sureshwaracharya says, Janma Prayojaga Muktam. So this is the view of Vedantins. More or less, Patanjali also accepts the same view. Of course, Vedantins do not use the word Karmashaya. Vedanta uses only one term, karma. That's a term which has become very popular now. Of course, not always in the correct implication. So, karma is the term that Vedanta uses. Karmashaya is the word that yoga philosophers use. Karmashaya means a repository, a platform, a repository where all the residual elements of karmas, actions, are retained, which again come to the surface when the external circumstances are very, very favorable. So the main difference in different systems of philosophy is, in a monotheistic system of religion, for example, maybe Abrahamic religions, and in popular Hindu, Vaishnava, Shakta traditions, God is the giver of all results. God, who is the creator of the world. Ishvara is the giver of all these results of actions according to Advaita. According to Purana system of philosophy, the creator Brahma is responsible. So Brahma is the dispenser of results of actions according to Puranas, mythological books. And according to monotheistic systems of philosophy, it is the God who creates this world, who protects us, who is also the dispenser of rewards and punishments according to our actions. And according to Advaita, it is Ishvara himself. So, coming back to the subject, the Tapa Duhkha. So, as I said earlier, Tapa Duhkha is common for all people. And Tapa Duhkha takes place in this way. First, obstruction or obstacle to enjoyment of pleasures, which creates dvesha, anxiety of losing an object that makes us happy, that also creates dukkha, suffering. And we become anxious. And again, sometimes when we are not able to achieve all that we want to achieve, we become hostile, we become unhappy, become upset, angry with certain people. So all these together create a phenomenon which is called Tapa Duhkha. Now, so as I said earlier, Parinama Duhkha is possible only for yogis. In fact, everyone should try to achieve this Parinama Duhkha. If you can worry about a noble object, a noble ideal, that's a great thing. But there's a great difference between Parinama Duhkha and Tapa Duhkha. Suppose you are a person of spiritually enlightened wisdom, who is a spiritually enlightened person. If that person worries about the problems that afflict the world, say Buddha for example, Buddha did not worry about anybody belonging to his life. When he was walking the streets, he saw a sick man, he saw a dead body being taken to the cremation ground, he saw an old man, miserable looking old person, and finally he saw an ascetic who was free from all this. These are the four images that transformed Buddha from the prince of a small, tiny kingdom into a world teacher, religious, spiritual teacher. Now, what was the dukkha that he underwent? It was not Tapa Duhkha or Samskara Duhkha that we are going to explain. It was a dukkha of a yogi. So when he saw an old person who was miserable looking, sitting in a street corner, old age is an unavoidable problem for all human beings. But Buddha was not old. In fact, he was only 28 years old, very healthy. He was the crown prince of the kingdom. So that's why, Vyasa says, Parinama Duhkha nama pratikula sukhavasthayam api yoginam eva krishnati. Sukhavastha, Buddha's condition was very, very pleasant, in fact. He was brought up in an atmosphere of luxury, free from all problems. He was a prince and he was healthy, he was young. He didn't have any of these problems. But suddenly he confronted the problem of sickness and old age and also death. Now these problems suddenly made him ask the question. So these things are going to happen. That's why Parinama Duhkha is related to future possibilities. Also, everyone is going to die. So that's the essence of human life. And what is so great about enjoying kingly comforts in the palace? And sickness could afflict anyone in the world. So no one can escape from the problem of death and sickness and old age. Then what is so great about enjoying life in this palace, enjoying all these luxuries? So it afflicted him. That's an affliction that is possible only for an advanced spiritual person. So if we can worry about others, we will not have to worry about ourselves. If we can worry about big things, then we won't have to worry about small things. So everyone should learn to worry about higher things. Not your own problems, but so the ability to worry about other people's problems is the beginning of spiritual wisdom. That's what distinguishes a spiritual person from a worldly minded person. A worldly minded person won't worry about the problems of other people. He worries about his own problem. When he loses money, he is unhappy. When others lose money, he is not bothered. But a Buddha was worried because he saw a total stranger in a very miserable condition, old, sickly, and begging in the streets. And then another total stranger, dead, and his dead body being taken to the cremation ground. So this is dukkha, suffering. So actually the suffering, the object of suffering, the real cause of suffering was something totally distinct and different from his own personal life concerns. It was related to somebody else. That is why it is said, yoginameva klishnadi. Only for spiritually enlightened person, yogis alone can worry about these universal problems. That's why that's the beginning of spiritual wisdom. That's why it is stated here, a yogi realizes and he suffers because he realizes the momentariness, the kshanikata of enjoyments and worldly objects. He is actually in a very happy situation. Still he worries because he realizes the transitoriness of these happy situations. That's the reason behind it. So that's why nacha indriyanam bhoga abhyasena vaitrushnyam kartum shakyam is a famous statement here. It is not possible to attain desirelessness by prolonging repeated sense enjoyment. We cannot quench the thirst of the senses to enjoy different things by letting them enjoy more and more, but only by acquiring this Parinama Duhkha. Second one, as I mentioned, is Tapa Duhkha. The second part, the second problem mentioned in the 15th sutra of the second chapter. That we should remember. This is a 15th sutra that appears in the second chapter, that is Sadhana Pada. Parinama, Tapa, Samskara Duhkaihi, Guna Vritti Virodhacha Dukkhameva Sarvam Vivekinaha. Mean to a person of discerning mind, everything is sorrowful. That's a literal translation. Okay, now we are going to deal with the Tapa Duhkha in greater detail. Now, there are different commentators who have explained the different aspects of this Tapa Duhkha. As I mentioned, Tapa Duhkha is directly related to Karmashaya. Karmashaya, we must remember, the repository of the residual impressions gathered in the chittam that remain accumulated there over several lives. So there are different commentators. According to some commentators like Bhoja, Dvesha, hatred towards obstacles or obstructions in the path of our enjoyment of physical worldly pleasures, that's the essence of Tapa Duhkha. It is called Dvesha. And according to some other people, some other commentators like Nagoji Bhatta is a famous commentator. He says even the sight of worldly objects can give us Tapa Duhkha. So when we see an object, suddenly the mind goes after that. So the mind develops a strong desire to enjoy them. But mind knows that it is not possible. That creates suffering, dukkha. That is Tapa Duhkha. But again, this wish to enjoy these worldly things that we know very well we cannot enjoy, already registers an impression in the chittam, the mind, and that's added to Karmashaya. So Karmashaya becomes reinforced by every sight of enjoyable worldly objects or worldly thoughts. So this is the second. The third one is guna vritti virodha. That is also we already discussed here. These mutual conflicts, mutual conflict of the gunas, the sattva guna, rijo guna, tamo guna, all these also create conflicts. Sukha, dukkha and moha, three important mental reactions to worldly objects. When the experiences are pleasurable, enjoyable, we are drawn towards them. When they are not enjoyable, then we become upset, we become lost, we become depressed, and again we become deluded, we become drawn towards these different objects. So how this happened, we can recapitulate. So according to the commentators, there is another dukkha, it is called Samskara Duhkha. This is also the third one. So Parinama Duhkha, Tapa Duhkha, Samskara Duhkha. The Samskara Duhkhas are related to the impressions and Vasanas created in our mind. Vasanas, impressions, memories, pleasure and pain that remain in the Karmashaya. These Vasanas, impressions come back to the mind, we call the memories. These memories prompt us towards actions, and these actions again reinforce the Karmashaya that also strengthen the grief that we undergo. These are the process. Now, here, of course, there is an interesting description by Vyasa. Vyasa's commentary is very famous. Vyasa's greatness was that he brings out some of the hidden truths, psychological truths, spiritual truths in the Patanjali Sutras. There is a statement in Vyasa's commentary, Akshipatra kalpohi vidwan iti yatha urnatandu akshipatre nyastaha sparshena dukkhayadi na anyeshu gatra avayavayeshu. It's a very interesting commentary. Akshipatra kalpohi vidwan iti. What's the nature of a person of spiritual wisdom? He becomes sensitive as the eyeball. Now how it happens? Suppose a small needle or a thorn touches the eyeball. The eyeball is terribly affected. Suppose the same thorn or needle touches our hand, feet, head, it won't be so terribly affected. So the mind of a yogi, of a spiritually enlightened person, becomes very sensitive. This sensitivity enables him to visualize the possibility of the present happy circumstances giving way to unhappiness and misery. Because his spiritual insight enables him to realize the transitoriness or the momentariness, the non-eternal nature of the present set of happy circumstances. Because his mind becomes akshipatra kalpaha, means as sensitive as the eyeball. Yatha urnatantu akshipatre nyastaha sparshena dukhedi nanyeshu gatra vaiveshu. Even is a small tiny object, a very, very thin thorn touches or hits the eyeball, it can cause a tremendous harm. It can hurt the eyes. But if the same object touches other parts of the body, which are strong and muscular, it won't have any impact. So there are many people who are not bothered whatever happens in this world. What yoga, Vedanta, philosophy, all these are nothing. So 24 hours, the life is meant for enjoyment. That's the view of many people. In fact, not many people will be interested in this Yoga Sutta. They will be interested in yoga, because yoga is related to, the anyeshu gatra avayaveshu. So Vyasa himself says, yoga, physical yoga helps you to build muscles and becomes physically strong. But it doesn't directly help us to develop the mind and make it as sensitive as akshipatra, means the eyeball. So the one important purpose of yoga is to develop this spiritual sensitivity, so that we are able to understand the transitoriness of worldly enjoyments and worldly pleasures. For such a yogi, will have a mind that goes far beyond the present, beyond the visible, looks far into future, into the beyond. And such a yogi is able to understand the transitoriness of enjoyments. Even when such a yogi is a trillionaire or a billionaire and is in a state of perfect health and enjoyment, like Buddha, for example, was living in a luxurious palace, physically strong and healthy. He was only 28 years old. He was a crown prince. But he was worrying about a dead body being taken to the cremation ground, which a normal human being won't worry much about. So the point is this: a yogi develops his mind, and he develops the spiritual sensitivity of his behavior and character. That's why sometimes we have a feeling, there's a great misunderstanding about yoga and Vedanta. It is a kind of negative approach. It's a negativism. It preaches kind of dissolution of the physical body, running away from the realities of material life. No, rather it primarily enables us to develop a spiritual sensitivity, so that even while living in this world of empirical realities, whether good or bad, even when we are surrounded by happy circumstances, we are able to realize the non-eternal nature, the transitoriness, the momentariness, the perishable nature of the present happy set of circumstances. If we can develop that spiritual sensitivity, then we will not really have any suffering. So that's why yogi suffers before physical suffering really happens. I mentioned earlier at the beginning of the class, very often it occurs to many of us. When we have a bad experience, an unfortunate, undesirable experience, we sometimes look back and think, well, perhaps this happened because I did not do a particular thing properly. Now, suppose you have this spiritual sensitivity, this discerning mind, at the time of doing it, then you won't do it. So to develop this spiritual sensitivity in such a way that we are able to understand, we are able to suffer because suffering really happens. This should be, if you need, we will have interaction later on this subject. If we can suffer because the real suffering happens, then there will be no suffering at all. On the other hand, if we do not suffer, even when we are surrounded by happy circumstances, then we are bound to suffer really. Otherwise, what happens? We are able to suffer even before the real suffering comes, so that the real suffering never really comes. This is Yogi is never unhappy. Buddha was never unhappy, because Buddha realized the possibility of suffering. So he suffered when he was living in a palace in luxurious circumstances. So he suffered when he saw the dead body of a person being taken to the cremation ground, when he saw an old man sitting, miserable looking person on the street corner, when he saw a beggar, and finally when he saw an ascetic who was happiness embodied. He was actually suffering. That night he he could not sleep. And that night he left his palace. So he must have suffered really for a few hours at least. So that suffering is Parinama Duhkha, which is we're really not suffering for others, for a higher cause. It is called Parinama Duhkha. That's why, Vyasa gives a very interesting commentary. Akshipatra kalpohi vidwan. Vidwan means wise person, yogi. His mind is like the eyeball, like the eyeball, which becomes very spiritually sensitive. So Vyasa continues his commentary. He says, Yatha chikitsa shastram chadurvyuham rogo rogahedu arogyam bhaishajyam ittevam idamabi shastram chadurvyuhameva yatatha samsara samsarahedu moksho mokshopaya iti. It's a very interesting discussion, very scientifically, very analytical. He says, medical science, for example, it has got 4 units, 4 components. Means sickness, the cause for the sickness, and health, state of being healthy, and also the way to become, the remedy to get rid of sickness and become healthy. These are the 4 components. Like that, he says, in yoga also, there are 4 important components. One is samsara. It means this physical world of senses and sense enjoyments. Dukkha bahula samsara heya. This is to be eradicated. Here we have to remember, this problem is related to the possibility of avoiding future sorrows. That is an important point to remember. Vyasa makes this very clear. So Patanjali also makes it very clear. What we have already suffered is one thing. What we are now going through is one thing. What we can avoid if we become wise today is something different. We are concerned with the third part of it. If we can really understand our nature, our mind, the problem, and the cause for the problem, then we can avoid the problems in future. So he says, first there is dukkha, and dukkha hetu, the cause for this dukkha or grief or sorrow is samsara, and this painful cycle of births, deaths, going through all the happy and unhappy circumstances, and finally not reaching our goal. This is the real problem to be solved. It is called Heya, the problem to be eradicated. The second one is this Pradhana Purushayoga Samyogo Heya Hetu. What's the real cause? We forget the fact that we are the conscious Atman, Purusha. And we forget this fact and we identify ourselves with all the multiple objects that appear before us, and we enjoy and we suffer. So when we are enjoying, we mislead ourselves into thinking that these enjoyments are going to be eternal. And then when these enjoyments disappear, when they give way to grief or sorrow, we are crushed, we are depressed. So how to get out of this problem? The problem can be solved only through this cessation of this association of the conscious Purusha and the unconscious Prakriti. I shall explain this. or misidentification with the sensory objects which constitute the evolution of Prakriti, according to Sankhya and Yoga philosophy, that is pradhana, that should be completely stopped, cessation. And then the way out of the problem, the solution is samyak darshanam. Hanupayaha samyak darshanam, proper understanding. The proper understanding, what the proper understanding is, can be explained in the light of the Parinama Duhkha, which is possible only for a yogi. So if we can develop a discerning mind, a spiritual sensitivity, we can avoid these problems occurring again in future. Now, I shall conclude the class right now, and then one announcement before we really conclude. This is the last class before the summer recess. The next class will be on Friday, September 18th at 7:30. So I will be out of station for 3-4 weeks, for 5 weeks. So there will be no class next Friday onwards till September 18th. So please remember, our next Friday class on Patanjali Yoga Sutras will be on Friday, September the 18th at 7:30 p.m. Thank you. Now we will have interaction. You can ask questions not only based on what we discussed today, but also based on, on the previous lessons or topics.
Swami, the yogi is always thinking of Parinama Duhkha, right? That means even if he is happy, he is thinking of the happiness will go away. So can it be explained like a paranoia kind of thing?
No, it's not bad. Really speaking, it is a sign of wisdom. You find it is not only among yogis, but even people who are mature, of mature wisdom, they will tell you, oh, don't worry, these things will pass away. It will change. So, but here in the context of the yogi, it goes much deeper than that. But one aspect of this Parinama Duhkha you find in the words of great teachers like Lao Tzu, Confucius, Buddha, and all this you find. See, when they talk about the problems of the world, they always say, these problems are not going to be eternal, just as the pleasures are not going to be eternal. So very often we mistake the momentary for the eternal. That's the real cause of the problems. A yogi directly makes you understand the transitoriness, the momentariness of these momentary empirical things. All sorrows, all problems are rooted in one important mistaken identity. We forget the non-eternal nature of the empirical experiences. That's what really happens. Not only we become depressed, we become lost, we become hostile. When somebody has done something harmful to another person, that person becomes extremely angry, excited, takes revenge, and so on. Dvesha. Because he thinks this is an eternal, this is permanent situation. Maybe next day that the person may become friendly again. But that part is forgotten. Yogi can make you see the other side. Yogi sees the whole picture. Most of us see only part of it. So when we see only one part of it, the tip of the iceberg, very often we mistake the tip of the iceberg to be the whole of iceberg. So most of the problems are related to this. See, that's what happened to Buddha. Buddha saw a sick person. He was not sick. Buddha himself was not sick. But he thought, well, this sickness, one day I also may become sick. One day I also may become old. So this is the example of spiritual wisdom, spiritual insight. But an average person may remember when he comes back from the crematorium but then in 2-3 days you will forget. Again, all the old samskaras and vasanas will come back with a vengeance, so he will remember. But a yogi always remembers this, he never forgets. What an average person remembers only when he returns from the crematorium, a yogi remembers all his life, to be very frank. The non-eternal nature, the momentariness of empirical things.
So, Parinama Duhkha is for yogis, right? Primarily,
The idea is, as it is, as is stated in the Patanjali Yoga Sutra, but in a way, it is related to higher wisdom, maturity, insight that you find among many, in the words of many teachers, different shades, different aspects you find. You find in everyday life, you find there are people who read a lot, who think a lot, and don't react too fast, reacting only in a proper manner. If somebody, an upstart, maybe angry person, becomes excited, the wise person may tell, wise woman or wise man may tell, oh, don't be excited, things will change. There you find there is an ability to look beyond the present. Of course, this is just one very small aspect of it. But a yogi looks far beyond all this, and he sees far beyond.
Yes. Then for people with Samskara Duhkha, they are kind of trapped in their own action cycle, like I said, like a karma cycle. They do the action, karma, has an impression, Karmashaya.
Yeah.
Then the same vritti.
Yes.
And then that again leads to the same karma.
Yeah.
How do they break out of that?
Yes. In fact, Tapa Duhkha and Samskara Duhkha are common for all people. Because people normally react differently to different circumstances. Dvesha or hostile feeling or raga. Too much of attachment or obsessive attachment to certain things, which both really trap the person. And also Samskara Duhkha, the Vasanas and vrittis that are stored up in the chitta, that make us act in a way that's not very desirable. Okay, now when we discuss the third part of the second chapter, that is called Ashtanga Yoga, which comes much later, where we describe the Ashtanga, beginning with Yama, Niyamasana, Pranayama, etc. At that time, we will discuss the problem, the way out of this problem. But now we are dealing with the description of what is called this Dukkha Chadurvyuha, the quadrangle of grief. This is the topic we are discussing. Later you find Patanjali gives a very wonderful exposition of a much more important and relevant topic, how to get out of this. So a proper understanding of our mind and its problems is the topic of discussion here. One way out is to enrich our mind, our chittam, Karmashaya itself, with more and more positive vrittis and vasanas and samskaras. Karmashaya is the cause of Tapa Duhkha, and in a way it is related to Samskara Duhkha also. So their negative impact can be reduced by trying to make an effort to do more and more good things, good thoughts, good actions. That we'll discuss when we deal with this important topic in the Ashtanga Yoga at the beginning with Yama and Niyama. We already discussed. In extensive discussions and in many of the commentaries later.
Swamiji, I was just curious, I guess this is kind of a technical thing, but why, if we have these samskaras and these tendencies from our karma, you're just talking about people remember or have abilities to do certain things that they should learn this stuff. Why don't we consciously remember this stuff? Is it a different part of, is it more unconscious, or if we have these tendencies, why don't we remember our past lives?
Yeah.
Or maybe some of us do, but...
Yes, yes. And the remembrance takes place as a reaction to external circumstances, stimuli.
Okay,
So,
sorry, you said
you see, external circumstances.
Right, right.
See, the Karmashaya contains the residual impressions gathered over several lives. Strong and weak, good and bad, mixed and so on. Now, how they come to the surface? They come to the surface not through direct effort. Through direct effort, we can bring the positive samskaras come to the surface. But for that also the Karmashaya should permit us. So, we must try to consciously do good things, speak good things, think good things. Then the positive Karmashaya impressions, residual impressions will come to the surface. And when they come to the surface, memory is revived. And that will help us, that will prompt us to do such good deeds again. And that will reinforce the storehouse of positive samskaras and impressions. And that will take us forward in spiritual life. So, for example, when you go to a bookstore, when you go to a library, all kinds of books and magazines are put there. What book you are going to choose, for example? If nobody is watching, or you may have in your room various books. What books you try to read and understand with great concentration, without anybody watching over you? What instinctively drives you to a certain things? From that you can understand the predominant residual impressions coming to Karmashaya.
One other question is...
So, but I shall continue this subject, finish this.
Okay.
So later on, Patanjali, the commentators say, so you should consciously try to physically drive yourself towards doing good things.
Right.
Physically you can make conscious effort, mentally it may not be possible. It's much more difficult to do conscious things mentally than physically. So gross actions, concrete gross actions at a physical level can be consciously done.
Right.
Mentally we have no control over our own mind, our own thought process. But to some extent you have control which way you go to the town, this way or that way. It's your own choice. So at the gross physical level we have a choice, option. So that's why, interestingly, some commentators will tell you at the physical level you consciously try to do good things, and that will slowly give you the power to think good thoughts and then good words. So we should begin with the concrete, the gross. Please, next you continue.
Yeah, I guess the other question, this is kind of silly, but why is the spiritual path so difficult? I mean, I've met a lot of smart people, a lot of wise people. My teacher, I think he might be enlightened, but I don't know. But it just seems very rare, for all these billions of people that have come across that it's so difficult. And even a person that practices it's still difficult. And then if you're scientifically trained, you're like, is this really true? Is this not? I'm just wondering if maybe it's more valuable because it's so difficult. What's the take on that?
It would have been very wonderful if we had this planet inhabited by 8 billion Buddhas, but never really happens.
Yeah.
So it really never happens. If spirituality were so easy for all to practice, and that's what happened in the Bible, the 3 temptations. Again, I should take you back to, I've taken you many times to Dostoevsky's Grand Inquisitor.
Yeah.
The 3 temptations are interpreted by Dostoevsky through the fantasy poem of Ivan Karamazov. So why Jesus rejected Satan's 3 temptations? So you can change all these stones into loaves of bread and bribe people to follow you. Jesus said, no, that won't work. They should follow me of their own. You cannot bribe 8 billion people inhabiting this planet to follow spirituality. That will not work. Because each of the karmas, each of the samskaras, antakarmas, should voluntarily, of themselves, should move forward. So freedom is an important part in spiritual life. It is true, in fact, some well-meaning people really imagine, and we should respect them for their real humanity. They say, if there was no famine at all, if there was no earthquake in Nepal, if there was no disease, if there was no cancer, how wonderful the world would have been. It's true, but it never really happens. So we are trying to analyze and explain the world as we find in front of us.
Right.
So we cannot wish away the present reality and imagine if the world was totally different, how wonderful it would have been, but never really happened. So that's why Vedanta and Yoga are very realistic. That's why if you can explain it in the light of a God creating this world on a fine morning, then only all these problems will arise. There will be no answer to that. We cannot admire a God who creates such a difficult world with all these problems. So we are trying to explain the reality from effect to cause. But all monotheistic religions, and also popular Hinduism, they solve the problem by positing a God who sits on a throne on a fine day and creates all this world in a very arbitrary manner. Then all the problems are solved. There is no scope for philosophy or mysticism. So in Vedanta and Yoga, we are trying to look around and see the world that we see in front of us and trying to explain it in a very realistic manner. So that's what we are trying to do. So what Yoga is trying to do is to help us to confront the realities in front of us and to change our own life, our own words, our own attitudes, behaviors, everything. Yoga is essentially an individual-oriented science. It can be practiced by all, but it is essentially a science of spiritual practice, which everyone can try.
Let's hope it's true.
Yeah. Slowly try to change our own mind so that we will have more peace of mind. As I said, Buddha's main problem was the problem of others. But then, and for that very reason, he did not have any problem for himself. That's why he said, if you worry about others, then you won't have to worry about yourself. On the other hand, if you never worry about others, then you will have to worry about yourself all the time.
Right.
You have to worry about, you have to worry about others. Which is essentially a much noble thing, much nobler and higher, spiritually much more elevating thing to do. That's why it is stated there, the Gita is stated, say, Yogakshemam Vahamyaham. I mean, I take the burden on my shoulders. Those who take the name of God, those who take refuge in God, I will bear their cross, to use a metaphor. So they won't worry about themselves. As we worry about others, the bigger questions of the world, then we won't have to worry about ourselves.
Thank you.
We've talked so much about our samskaras, the karmas, and the things that we're cycling around in each life. We've talked about trying to break that cycle by doing good deeds. But sometimes I feel like as I'm moving through my life to really understand and articulate, like as I'm moving through my life and I'm coming and confronting these things that are upsetting, or I know that I'm running up against some conflict or thing that's causing me some suffering, and I can say, oh, it'll pass, there's these ups and downs and they'll come and go, and it's transient. But yet there's something about the entire cycle of this, of being able to say, oh, this is the samskara that I'm dealing with. This is the karma that I'm dealing with. And how does the yogis gain insight into understanding what their particular challenges in this life, in this moment, in order to be able to then, from the knowledge, the knowing, the Gnostic way of like, oh, this is actually what I'm facing with, and this is my effort to break.
Yes. And one method is we have to develop a natural interest in doing things which will somehow help us in spiritual life. All of us have some natural interest in certain things. So sometimes this is more related to the Bhakti school of philosophy, the devotional school. If you can develop a natural interest in doing things in certain areas which are spiritually helpful, that's one way to build up a spiritual karmashaya, a strong component of tendencies and impressions which are helpful in spiritual life.
But how does that help you understand what the samskara is that you're dealing with in your life that you're trying to break out of? That might, on that one hand, you might be creating, the goodwill, good karma from good gestures, but it doesn't necessarily help to foster an understanding of the actual samskara that you're dealing with.
Again, when
like if it's ego, if it's whatever the mistaken identity or the challenges that you're repeating over and over again.
Yes, I mentioned some time back, in spiritual life, when we take some steps, real steps, then our own mind evolves and you find solutions and answers coming from within ourselves. So a thorough roadmap cannot be constructed for spiritual life. When we take the first few steps, as I mentioned earlier, we read books, we read many things, try to read some spiritually helpful books. We see many things, try to see things that are spiritually helpful. We think many thoughts, try to direct our mind to spiritually helpful thought currents. Like that, if we give spiritual orientation to whatever we do, after some time you find our own mind evolves. The mind, after some time, gets a new equipment, spiritual equipment. It evolves, it changes, and it will guide you to the next step. So we cannot make a thorough, complete roadmap before we even start the journey. That's one main difference between spiritual life and all other areas of life. In spiritual life, we are playing with our own mind. I mentioned this earlier. Even when you take a good book and read, or you read book of prayers, or Bible, any spiritually helpful teachings of Buddha, Gita, anything that you take, and read for some days without reading anything, you find after 5 days your mind is different from what it was before we actually started reading it. But right now we are trying to make a complete roadmap for the whole spiritual journey before we take the first step. So in spiritual life, when we really start doing, mind also slowly evolves.
So essentially you're saying that having insight into your own maladies or your own,
yes.
having insight, trying to undo your own ignorance is really not the solution.
To be very frank, your questions, the way you put your questions themselves show that you are making a sincere effort. Such questions are natural for a very sincere spiritual seeker who makes an effort. But these questions will get automatically answered as you go ahead. That's a real reason. Serious questions are, related to actual spiritual life, emerge in the mind when we take some steps. But as we proceed further, regular practices, the prayer, reading of spiritually elevating books will take the mind along with it, and you find mind itself evolves and changes because it gets newly enriched, reinforced with spiritual ideas. That's the idea.